Can anyone stop Xi Jinping from further consolidating power? Is there any hope for the Chinese pro-democracy movement? And finally, how will this murderous dictatorship end? China is one of the world's most repressive authoritarian regimes. Although statistics are not available, we know it executes more of its citizens than any country in the world, including many political prisoners. Freedom of speech, political liberties, and the flow of information are all strictly curtailed. The government maintains a pervasive surveillance apparatus, monitoring and censoring online activities and public discourse. Activists, journalists, and human rights defenders are harassed, imprisoned, and often just vanish for challenging the state's authority. Before we talk about the current state of the resistance, let's talk about the pro-democracy movements of the past several decades. In 1978, a Beijing resident, Wei Jingsheng, put up a handwritten poster on a wall in Beijing, seeking to promote free speech and democracy in China. The movement quickly gained momentum as more and more people posted to the wall. What became known as the Democracy Wall provided a platform for people to openly express their opinions and engage in public discourse before the advent of social media. However, the activists were harassed and intimidated by the authorities. The posters were torn down, and many activists were arrested, eventually leading to the wall's demise. Then there's the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989, one of the most iconic moments in the history of China, when students and intellectuals gathered in Tiananmen Square to advocate for democratic rights. What began as a student-led pro-democracy movement demanding political reform, freedom of speech, and an end to corruption in the Chinese Communist Party quickly grew into a massive gathering of hundreds of thousands of people. CCP's response was brutal. The Chinese military, armed with tanks and rifles, advanced on Tiananmen Square and eventually opened fire. The official death count remains unknown, but it is estimated hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese citizens lost their lives. In the aftermath, the Chinese Communist Party took severe measures to suppress all pro-democracy movements, employing a campaign of censorship, propaganda, and arrests to quell any remnants of dissent. It is estimated as many as tens of thousands of people were arrested in the wake of the protests. Since Tiananmen Square, there have been intermittent calls for democracy in China, but the sad truth is the movement has never regained its steam. There was a brief resurgence in 2008 when a group of over 300 prominent Chinese activists, intellectuals, and academics published Charter 08, a manifesto calling for democratic reforms and the protection of human rights. Again, the Chinese government cracked down hard on its advocates. Many signatories were arrested, harassed, or placed under surveillance. Then there were the protests to China's zero COVID policies in 2022, but these too were quickly and decisively squashed. In the late 70s, under Deng Xiaoping, China enacted the open door policy to import Western knowledge and open the country to foreign trade and investment. The open door policy also gave Chinese citizens increasing access to Western information via the internet. However, due to concerns such information could lead to political instability, the government launched the Golden Shield Project, also known as the Great Firewall of China, in 2000 to control access to the internet. Since Xi Jinping took office in 2013, China has accelerated this totalitarian trend. The Golden Shield Project has expanded into a comprehensive surveillance network. The system further expanded in the 2010s with the implementation of the Safe Cities Initiative. This program aims to control urban environments using facial recognition, biometric data collection, and artificial intelligence to punish dissent. It is estimated the country now has over 700 million surveillance cameras, which means there is one lens for every 2 citizens. Furthermore, a social credit system was implemented in the early 2010s, through which the government monitors its citizens' every move and assigns them a credit score based on their behavior. The system impacts access to loans, job opportunities, travel privileges, and even social interactions. It also creates a culture of fear where individuals face severe consequences for even minor infractions. Then there's the cybersecurity law, enacted in 2017, which gives the Chinese government extensive control over internet traffic. Since its enactment, journalists and human rights defenders who dare to criticize the government face harassment and imprisonment, or just disappear. Furthering the trend toward authoritarianism under Xi is China's treatment of ethnic and religious minorities. such as the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang and the Tibetans. It is estimated over 1 million Uyghurs have been detained in detention camps since 2017, where they are subjected to forced labor and cultural assimilation efforts. According to the FBI, since 2014, Xi Jinping has also spearheaded a program known as Fox Hunt. While China describes it as an international anti-corruption campaign, in reality, it targets citizens living outside China who are seen as threats while threatening their families at home. Although on life support in mainland China, the Chinese democracy movement lives on outside the mainland, and in recent years, Hong Kong has been the nexus. The umbrella movement took form after the National People's Congress issued a decision reforming Hong Kong's electoral system in 2014. In 2019, the extradition law accelerated the movement as it revolted against Beijing's attempt to apply mainland China's laws to Hong Kong. Estimates say the protests that followed may have drawn as many as 2 million people. Although the bill was officially withdrawn late that year, it awakened Hong Kong citizens to Beijing's intention to control its population. Many Hong Kong organizations fought back, including the China Human Rights Lawyers Concern Group, a nonprofit providing legal aid and representation to human rights activists, political dissidents, and other individuals whose rights have been violated. Then there was Demosisto, the pro-democracy political party led by Joshua Wong, Agnes Chow, and Nathan Law. Demosisto advocated for a referendum to determine Hong Kong's sovereignty with the goal of obtaining autonomy. Law, then 23, even became the youngest candidate ever to be elected to Hong Kong's Legislative Council. However, after the national security law was implemented, both these organizations and many others were disbanded in response to the Beijing-controlled authorities' harassment and imprisonment of its members. Other prominent organizations, including the Civil Human Rights Front, or CHRF, the Hong Kong Professional Teachers Union, and the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, were all disbanded in 2021 under increasing pressure from authorities. The enactment of the national security law has cast a pall on the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Joshua Wong, Agnes Chow, and Nathan Law were all imprisoned, as were the CHRS founders and many, many more prominent pro-democracy advocates. For now, Beijing seems to have a stranglehold on the resistance in Hong Kong. Now, let's talk about the resistance within China. Many courageous individuals have taken up the cause of liberty over the years. The New Citizens Movement, founded by Xu Zhiyong, emerged in 2012 and aimed to promote civil society, constitutionalism, and rule of law. Unfortunately, most of the leaders of the movement have been in prison, and Xu himself was recently sentenced to 14 years in a closed trial. Joshua Wong went on to become a symbol of resistance against Beijing's tightening grip on Hong Kong. Despite his continued imprisonment, Wong remains unwavering in his commitment to the cause of freedom. If you haven't seen it yet, check out the documentary Joshua, Teenager vs. Superpower on Netflix. Then there's Jimmy Lai, a media tycoon and founder of Next Digital, which owned the influential Apple Daily newspaper. Lai has been a vocal critic of the Chinese Communist Party and an advocate for democracy and autonomy for Hong Kong. Unfortunately, Apple Daily has been shuttered, and Lai too was arrested under the national security law and eventually sentenced to 5 years in prison. These are but a few of the prominent pro-democracy advocates in China. In conducting research for this story, we found nearly all of them have been imprisoned, fled, or in shockingly high numbers just disappeared, confirming the Chinese Communist Party is even more evil than we had imagined. However, let's not overlook the Chinese citizens still fighting within China. Although recently criminalized by the CCP, virtual private networks have allowed individuals to spread their message, organize protests, and expose human rights abuses. These netizens, as internet users are called in China, may number hundreds of millions. Despite the oppression within China and Hong Kong, many courageous individuals and organizations continue their efforts to advocate for change in China from exile. For instance, there's the Chinese Human Rights Defenders Network, which documents human rights abuses, provides support for activists, and advocates for democracy. Founded by prominent pro-democracy advocate Tang Biao and other activists in China, it was forced to move to Washington, D.C. in 2018 after the surveillance and arbitrary detentions of its members. Tang now continues his activism from exile in the U.S. Then there's the China Digital Times, Founded by academic and journalist Xiao Xiang, the Times is an independent platform now operating in the US that provides uncensored information to the Chinese people. Mr. Xiao spent years in Chinese prisons for his participation in the Tiananmen Square protests and his advocacy for a democratic China. Today, he continues to educate students and advocate for reform as a professor at UC Berkeley. Agnes Chow and Nathan Law were eventually released and continue their activism. Law, now in exile in the UK, is under constant threat from Beijing, yet he continues his advocacy using social media and by organizing marches for a free Hong Kong. Recently, the Chinese government placed a bounty on his head for the equivalent of 128,000 US dollars, and yet he persists. Finally, Wei Jingsheng, the aforementioned instigator of the Democracy Wall movement, continues his work as an internationally revered human rights activist. His activism led to his arrest in 1979, and he spent over 18 years in Chinese prisons, during which he continued to advocate for democracy and write essays promoting political reform. He now works in exile in the US. Unfortunately, Beijing's intensifying crackdown on civil society groups and domestic censorship has made it extremely difficult for these organizations overseas to connect with dissenters in China. The CCP routinely forces civil society groups to cease their operations and often threatens or arrests the families of dissenters living abroad. The Chinese government has been incredibly successful in breaking any connection between immigrants and the dissidents living in China. In summary, there is no coherent pro-democracy movement in China, and none of the exiled organizations carry enough weight to fuel a democratic revolution. The Chinese Communist Party is too strong and has been incredibly effective in quashing dissent, both within China and abroad. Furthermore, we must concede the CCP does still have the confidence of much of the Chinese population due to decades of economic growth, even if it was spurred by free market capitalism. But take heart, the future of the Chinese pro-democracy movement may not be as bleak as it looks. That's because in creating an increasingly totalitarian state, Xi Jinping is now sowing the seeds for the Chinese Communist Party's demise. Xi has abandoned Deng Xiaoping's market reforms that led to China's prosperity, and his recent intrusion into private business is destined to kill innovation and creativity. The CCP also controls all China's banks. In a free market system, banks must have the discipline to only loan to viable businesses, while in China, the state selects which industries and businesses get loans. Some estimate the amount of bad loans in China may be near 40%, and debt levels in both the government and corporate spheres are reaching unprecedented levels. When the state controls all the winners and losers, the entire system becomes rigid and incapable of responding to market needs. Furthermore, China's growth model has been heavily reliant on government spending on infrastructure and housing, which has led to overcapacity in many industries. While this spending has contributed to China's phenomenal GDP growth, that growth is now slowing and is simply unsustainable in the long term. Finally, despite what some political observers say, the desire for individual freedom is inherent in every human being, including Asians. Despite the CCP's attempt to control information, an increasingly educated and prosperous population will naturally demand its freedoms. The authoritarian model has never worked throughout history, and it won't start now. Thus, we predict the person who will bring an end to CCP rule in China is Xi Jinping himself. We predict the Chinese Communist Party will collapse along with the economy within the next 20 years. Let's make it 17. The biggest questions will be who will take power and what type of government will they form. Our sincere hope is that it will be a democracy for the great Chinese people. It would be a boon to the future of humankind and would release over 1.4 billion people from the fear and oppression inflicted every day by the Chinese Communist Party. Long live the great Chinese people, and long live the resistance.